So it's understanding the root of the issue. What do we define as Zionism? So Zionism is actually a political ideology, and Zionism rose to prominence in the beginning of the 19th century. So during the 1820s, it basically espouses the formation of a national home for the Jewish people. And actually, it's interestingly enough, Zionism began as a Christian project before it was a Jewish one. So this was what was considered a debate within the evangelical Christian church. And they saw that actually the migration of the Jews to Palestine, so this is the evangelical Christians, would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah. Then that would lead to the coming of the Messiah, and that would lead to ultimately the resurrection of the dead, the conversion of the Jews to Christianity or to hell, as they believe. And so anti-Zionism became a moral position at that time against romantic nationalism and against Christian fundamentalism that today we call Christian Zionism, really. So it's really interesting when we actually find out that Zionism began as a Christian project before it was a Jewish one. And when the Jewish intellectuals adopted Zionism as a response to anti-Semitism that existed in the beginning of the 20th century, their antagonists were mainly other Jews. Their antagonists, the antagonists of the Zionist project, were other Jews that basically saw the premature return to Palestine as tampering with the will of God. And they actually viewed it as a heresy to substitute a rich monotheistic religion with this poor idea of romantic nationalism. So actually, it's really interesting to know that when the Balfour Declaration, the motion was passed in 1917 in Parliament by Arthur Balfour, he actually weaponized anti-Semitism. He stoked up and he activated the slogan of anti-Semitism. Imagine, he was a proponent of Zionism. He was advocating for the creation of a homeland for the Jewish people. And obviously this wasn't because he cared about the Jewish people and he wanted to realize this kind of Zionist dream, but it was ultimately in the meeting of the interests between the imperialists and the Zionists. So the Zionists themselves were hunters for sources of power that could actualize their vision of a Jewish homeland, and wherever the imperialists place the Zionists, they will follow. And that's why actually, if you look at the original documents of Zionism, as purported by the father of Zionism, as they call him, Theodor Herzl, the initial discussion was actually on creating this Jewish homeland in British East Africa. They wanted to create it in British East Africa, but then Britain came along and said, hold on, that's not really going to serve our interests. Palestine is a very strategic location. We want to maintain a military base in the heart and in the core of the Middle East. And what is the function that we see of the wrong state today? The function of the wrong state is to basically act as a stick for the superpower. So before it was Britain and today it's America. And that stick, who is holding that stick? America's holding that stick. So America is the one that is in full control of the wrong state, and its existence wholly and completely depends on it, militarily, financially, economically, etc. So actually you find that Arthur Balfour himself, he used terminology like Jews are an alien and Jews are a hostile people in order to encourage the migration of Jews to historic Palestine. And you'd also be interested to know that within the British cabinet at that time, the only Jew, Edwin Montagu, he actually called Zionism a mischievous political creed, because he could look through it. He could look at how actually Zionism was being weaponized to achieve the agenda. How anti-Semitism was being weaponized in order to achieve the agenda of the British Empire at that time. And he actually saw how Zionism was, how it was having, or it would potentially have negative impacts on the lives of wealthy British Jews who would end up migrating to this land and would be at the mercy of a superpower.
Is that why we see like a lot of Jewish people at protests for Palestine?
Yeah, you find there are Jewish rabbis, particularly, but I would argue those Jewish rabbis are probably a minority. But you find them within protests, especially those who are the Notori Kata, as they call themselves. And you actually find that they are very orthodox in their practice of Judaism. So for example, on Saturdays, it is their Sabbath, and they observe it very religiously. I mean, even when you see them coming to protests, they don't use technology on those days. They don't even speak to women on those days. And that's how conservative they are. They don't use public transport, for example. I'm just giving you idea of how, when I look at them, I genuinely regard them as real Jews. Like, they take their religion very, very
So
seriously.
it's not a war of religion in Palestine.
But religion has been weaponized. That's ultimately the case. So in 2018, you see that actually the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, they passed a law which basically called the wrong state the nation state of the Jewish people. So what was the big hysteria there is that all this apartheid that's been existing since 1947 has officially become codified within the law in 2018. And the reason they did that, the reason that they called the wrong state a Jewish state exclusively, so citizenship is exclusively for the Jewish people. So right now in the wrong state, you have around 5 million Israeli settlers, and you have about 2 million Palestinians living there. The 2 million Palestinians are not recognized as citizens. They're not recognized as citizens due to the nation state bill that was passed, and that categorically only gives citizenship to Jewish people. Now, this coincided with the rise of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And if you look at the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, in the 12 examples given, around 7 or 8 of them mention Israel. And this is huge. So this means, if you look at some of the examples given, if you call the wrong state a racist endeavor, that will classify as anti-Semitism, right? Because this is a Jewish state, right? So what they're trying to purposefully conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And the sole purpose is to stifle criticism on the wrong state. It's to stifle any kind of debate. It's to silence that tiny percentage of independent media that's not under the control of the mainstream media, that's not under the control of the Zionist lobby. And we see practical examples of how this manifested. So, for example, the constant onslaught and smear campaign on Jeremy Corbyn to bring him down as an anti-Semite. It's really interesting if you look at Corbyn's history of standing in solidarity with the Jews and fighting neo-Nazis. During the 1970s, he was pivotal in organizing mass protests in Wood Green against neo-Nazis that wanted to burn synagogues, for example. And he has a well-documented history of fighting racism as an anti-racist campaigner. But you find that actually the mass media was so successful in smearing him to the extent that the mass population gave into the whole hysteria that was weaponized with the whole anti-Semitism. And the same was the case in America, for example, with the delegitimization of Ilhan Omar, who is a congresswoman. So we have many examples of that, how right now anti-Semitism, this new threat of anti-Semitism, was particularly heightened post 9/11. And Norman Finkelstein has written a lot about this new threat of anti-Semitism, and how this new threat of anti-Semitism, it's not concerned with the crude forms of anti-Semitism, but it's really concerned with sort of fighting what is considered to be Jewish privilege or Jewish interests on a higher level. So if you question, for example, the state of Israel, the wrong state, for example, if you question the influence of the Zionist lobby, the Israeli lobby in various countries in the West, particularly in America, which is very, very strong. And it's really interesting, when I was talking to you about the evangelical Christians, they are staunch anti-Semites, but at the same time, they are very, very pro-Zionism. And actually, they're pro-Zionism because they're anti-Semites. So their idea is that the Jews, we want to contain them in this land. And if we contain them in this land, then that means that we don't have to see their sight again in the West, right? And so that's why it's really interesting when we talk about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. For example, we raised the question of Arthur Balfour, right? He was someone who stated what was considered anti-Semitic, right? But at the same time, he advocated for the Zionist cause. And you have many Jews who are, as we've mentioned, they're Jews. But do you know what? It becomes really interesting because Jews like, for example, Noam Chomsky, and you have Norman Finkelstein, for example. His parents were actually, they suffered during the Holocaust. His parents, his whole family was exterminated. But you know what they call him? They don't call him an anti-Semite because he's a Jew. They call him a self-hating Jew. They say he needs psychiatric help. That's the way that they frame Jews that are basically anti-Zionism, because they see the reality for what it is. They see that Zionism is just an extension of colonialism, and they deal with the facts on the ground. They don't deal with the so-called assertions that Jews have a right to this land because they inhabited this land 3,000 years ago, when actual evidence and history on the ground actually shows that Jews inhabited that land less than even Muslims did, or even Christians. They don't use these stories which the wrong state tries to use to justify their presence. When we're talking about anti-Semitism, we should point our fingers at the wrong state and say, how dare you actually take advantage of real Jewish suffering and use that as a political tool, right? As a so-called Jewish state, you are actually the reason that we are witnessing anti-Semitism and that there is a rise in anti-Semitism. So it just shows you that even as they call themselves the so-called Jewish state, they don't really care about really the interests of the Jews and the diaspora. They couldn't care less, because if they cared, then they wouldn't weaponize anti-Semitism in that kind of way. And can you imagine how the mass populations feel when they see, for example, someone like Jeremy Corbyn is actually innocent of these smear allegations, and these smear allegations are being weaponized against him? That actually, what that does is it waters down Jewish suffering. If everything starts getting labeled as anti-Semitic, do you know what people will start doing? They'll come out and they'll say, is it anti-Semitic to be anti-Zionist? If that's the case, then I'm anti-Semitic. Do you see what I'm saying? If that's the default position, if the default position that's codified within the law is that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, well, I'm an anti-Zionist. If that makes me an anti-Semite, well then, so be it, right? Do you see what I'm saying? That's based on what's codified within the law. But obviously, the sentiment is not against ordinary Jewish people. The sentiment is against, and let's point back to the root cause, it's against the usurpers of land. It's against those who commit the worst, grave human rights violations. And even worse than that, they use the name of religion as a cover for that. And that's what needs to be ultimately tackled in this whole discussion.